My name is Alan Leipzig, and I am honored to be the moderator here at our debate. To my left is Ed Tabash, constitutional lawyer and chairman of the board for the Center for Inquiry, who has debated many religious speakers of prominence, including Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, and Peter von Inhagen. The son of an Auschwitz survivor and an Orthodox rabbi, after decades of spiritual searching, Mr. Tabash has come to the conclusion that the universe is natural and not supernatural. To my right, Tom Trento, one of the most acclaimed academic activists in the United States today, who is continually found going toe-to-toe with people such as the Muslim Brotherhood and exposing radical agendas, co-author of Sharia, America Threat. He is often called upon by the modern media in order to give an authoritative view of Islamic ideology. Now, for this debate, there has been an agreed coin toss. So, Mr. Trento will go first, and Mr. Tabash will go second. But a few words of note first. Please, your ringtone is probably the most fascinating pop culture reference anyone has ever heard, but save it for later. Please save it for later. Also, if you wish to ask questions, and I certainly hope you do, considering the amount of intelligence and experience that I have behind me, there will be 2 volunteers who will shortly come down the rows with pens and index cards. We will not be passing around the microphone. Questions will be done on the index cards. They will be passed up for me. We will have a 30-minute question time, and I will read the questions out, and I will endeavor to make sure that each debater gets as close to an equal amount of questions as I can. Now, for our topic tonight, does God exist? I will first call up to the podium Mr. Tom Trento. Please let us have some applause for him and how important he is. Mr. Trento will have 20 minutes for his opening talk, as will Mr. Tabash.
All right, Alan, thank you very much for moderating. Sarah, where's Sarah? Thank you for the invitation here. And Eddie, most of all, Eddie, thank you for going through the selection process. I felt like I was auditioning for a football team or something, and for selecting me to stand here as your opponent, but as a friend. Through the past weeks, we've become friendly over the phone and through email. And meeting just recently, just a wonderful, wonderful man. Wrong, of course, on this issue, but still a wonderful man. Thank all of you for taking time on a Sunday to come out and hear a debate on does God exist. Let me tell you at the outset, this could not be too loud. You want to crank this down a little bit? It's the way I talk. This could not be more of a waste of time for every one of you in here coming tonight to this debate. If you did not hear that, I'll repeat it and I'll stand back a little bit. This is an unadulterated, categorical waste of time for every single person in here this evening. If my opponent is correct. Conversely, if I am correct, this quite possibly could be one of the most important events in your eternal life. Next couple of hours will determine that. Hi everybody, Tom Trento. Nice to meet you down here at FIU. I've been down here a few times through the years. It's always good when people are involved in debates on that side listening to know a little bit about the individual that is up there espousing a particular position. Currently I run a counterterrorism organization that fights Islamic Jihad. And I'm very involved around the world, primarily in the United States, fighting the terrorism issues that you see. I run an organization, The United West, and we do a tremendous amount of education, speaking, TV, writing, television. I have a daily radio show out of South Florida and an internet TV show dealing with these issues. And but a few years ago, I was running a Christian organization, a Christian apologetics organization. In college, I was, carefree New Jersey Italian guy, driving a brand new Porsche, having a blast, doing a little bit of work here and there, and enjoying life. Confronted in my fraternity house with an opportunity to debate the Bible. I felt I was a tremendous debater. If you grew up in a Sicilian family, you got to learn to argue to survive, let me tell you. And I said, yeah, I'll knock that guy off. And every week we had a Bible study in our fraternity house, which was a little bizarre to say the least. But after 3 or 4 months of asking a lot of questions, getting good answers, and then having questions asked of me and having no answers, I said, this stuff makes sense. I ironically was headed into the FBI at that point. I had done a degree in law enforcement, and my life changed very dramatically. Became one of those born-again Christians, and went to Bible school, studied theology and Greek, then did a master's in philosophy at seminary, and I'm trained as an apologist, a Christian apologist. And for 10 years I ran an organization that did this as my job, running around the country, debating folks like Eddie and every ism, communism, Nazism, materialism, whatever it was, on campuses all over the place. And they're very valuable. I think these debates are extremely valuable. From there, and that's 40 years or so I've been running around doing this stuff. I have been persuaded that God exists by the evidence and the confirmation of that persuasion by my experience. I could, for the sake of my purpose, in terms of my belief, I could leave right now and say, God exists. I evaluated the evidence. I've been doing it for 40 years. My experience over those years has confirmed the validation and analysis of the evidence experientially. So there's two sides to this coin. There's the analytical investigation, the hard scholarship required to dig down deeply on complex issues. But then those parameters lead to some sort of logical conclusion, and then the experience takes over. That which you thought not believing, you wind up believing, sometimes against your will, but driven by the evidence. And then your experience in life, 40 years, confirms the evaluation of the evidence. And to this day, now I leave it open. Maybe Eddie and his arguments are so persuasive, and I am geared for truth, not necessarily theism or Christianity. And I'm not arguing Christianity this evening. It's not the topic. It's theism. Maybe Eddie's arguments are so persuasive that I'll change my mind. I leave that possibility open. Unlike, and maybe we have a different metric here this evening, unlike most atheists I've debated, de facto a priori, no possibility. In terms of the construction of the Weltanschauung, no possibility of a change of mind without violating the fundamental epistemological basis upon which that individual stands. Very important what I just said. I hope, I'll explain that as we go through this. So my objective this evening is simply to share a little bit of my life, my experience, what I understand to be true with you. If I had to entitle this evening, I would entitle it, Why I Do Not Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. why I do not have enough faith to be an atheist. Embedded in that proposition is the fact that faith is a necessary component of belief, and that evidence drives faith to a particular logical conclusion. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist because the evidence for atheism is seriously lacking. It's my job this evening to present the reasons why I believe what I believe. Pretty simple. At heart, I'm a skeptic. I really am. You want to tell me something, fine. Let's discuss it. You got to present some reasons for it. And I've operated that way all my life, and I found it a pretty good way to operate. Let's see. There's three basic reasons why I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. First reason is free and open inquiry. All my life, I never drew myself into a box, put myself in an elevator with four walls and said, in terms of the quest for truth or the determination of what life is really about, I cannot exceed this parameter right here. I threw everything on the table. Open and free inquiry. Throw out a proposition, panspermia, Carl Sagan. Aliens threw sperm into the galaxies, and that's how life occurred here on Earth. Okay, I'll take a look at that, see if that fits the test of truth that the Western world at least goes by. If we're going to launch off of the Western Aristotelian logical constructs for discussion tonight, we'll have a lot of problems. We start putting Eastern mysticism in here, and the mind is this and that. We can deal with that, but I'm speaking from a Western Aristotelian logical perspective this evening. And I can't be an atheist because atheism confines itself to a particular philosophical construct, which is gross materialism. Nothing more than what can be empirically verified. There is no other world. And analogously, the atheistic construct, in its purity, you may hear a pseudo-atheism this evening. You may hear a pop-atheism this evening. I'm not debating pseudo or pop-atheism. I'm debating OED atheism. Out of the OED, that's the atheism I'm debating. Eddie, with all due respect, is an individual espousing a position. I'm drilling down maybe much more deeply than Eddie even holds to in this position. Well, when you say from an epistemological position, that's all that there is, you're confining yourself to these four walls. My philosophical worldview, my Weltanschauung, allows the consideration of the material world empirically verified, but it also allows outside, the mystical, if you want, the non-material, the world where thought or love, aesthetics, beauty, life, wonder, those things float around. Beauty doesn't float in wood. Love can't be confined to a material element. Fatal flaws for the atheistic modality. I live in a world that includes outside investigation of material and immaterial potential reality. It's one of the reasons I can't be an atheist, because they're confined to the materialistic world. Notwithstanding the fancy dancing you'll see in a little while about that's not my position, but intellectually it is, and I'll show you how. Another reason I don't have enough faith to be an atheist is I got to kick the crap out of the big questions. I don't want the big questions kicking the crap out of me. Through these years, I've interviewed thousands of people around the world and asked them the big questions. Where'd you come from? Why are you here? What's right? What's wrong? And where the hell are you going? Those questions bothered me they kicked the crap out of me for a while. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist because I need definitive answers to the big questions. I need to kick the crap out of those questions, understand them, put them in their proper perspective as a result of the hard intellectual analysis and rigorous work and come up with answers that make more sense and require less faith than my friend Eddie. Third reason I don't have enough faith to be an atheist is expressed quite eloquently by Bertrand Russell in his one of his little essays on why he's not a Christian. He said, hey guys, at the end of the day, you become a banquet for the worms. Banquet for the worms. Great atheist. Actually, Bertrand Russell said he was an atheist on the street in the popular world. But he said intellectually atheism does not maintain the intellectual rigorous evaluation. He said, I'm an agnostic when I am with my philosopher friends and my physicist friends. He made a distinction. An atheist, now, come on, Bertram, give us a break. I'm an atheist when I'm dealing with theists, but I'm really an agnostic when I'm dealing with thinkers. Because we know, as Isaac Asimov said, we had an ongoing debate with Isaac Asimov, my organization, over these issues. And I am not a smart guy. I'm a hard worker. There are people that are naturally smart. Whatever I know, I've done a lot of hard work to understand, but we had a genius on staff at Christian Research Associates. Ongoing debate with Asimov, and he was kicking Asimov's butt. And then Asimov in Humanism magazine, Secular Humanism, about 1982, 83, before he died, he wrote, he finally came out of the closet. He said, I do not have the evidence to be an atheist. He said, intellectually or empirically, I am an emotional atheist. It's where I want to be. Well, that's nice, Isaac, but that cheats intellectually, and if you guys out there looking for truth buy into that nonsense, then it's to your own demise intellectually in terms of your lifestyle. This is serious business we're talking about right here. And look at all the wonder there is in the world. Those of you who are married and have kids, those of you working in this school right now for your first or second degree, put that sheepskin on the wall. All of that, 15 billion years, reality has been around. All of that. What is 80 years? Maybe some of you lived to 90. Maybe some to 100. What's 100 over 15 billion? I'm not a mathematician. How many years has humanity been around? Whatever the number is, millions. 100 years compared to that, and you wind up in a box with slugs coming in and out, eating you and spitting you out. That's what you have to look for? Then life ultimately, not immediately, ultimately has no real meaning. You can have pseudo-meaning or pop meaning or confuse yourself that there's real meaning. But when put against the buzzsaw of reality, when put against the buzzsaw of, hey, wait, I've done good in my country, and though I may be a banquet for the worms, my legacy lives on, but you don't live on. Who the hell cares if your legacy lives on if you as an individual and Blaise Pascal in the 1600s, French philosopher, physicist, he had a little wager. He said, guess what, folks? It's 50-50. There is a God or there ain't a God. 50-50. And I'll lay out Pascal's wager in a little bit. But he said 50-50. And he said, seems to me, that's a big, serious bet on life. And if you live the theistic life as you're supposed to, not as the church tells you or as some people may live it, but as you're supposed to, Pascal said in the 1600s, you've lived a wonderful life, and you become, he didn't say a banquet for the worms, Russell came a little after him, but he said, you've lived a good life, and now it doesn't matter. You've been annihilated. It's a doctrine of annihilation, it's called. Conversely, 50-50 bet, every atheist in here, 50-50 bet. Flip a coin. I guarantee you the coin says, "In God we trust" on it too. But flip a coin. 50-50 when you go home. See what happens. 50-50. That you spend eternity separated from God, if he exists, or that you get annihilated. Interesting. All right, anyway, what are we going to do? I got a couple of minutes left, right? Here's where we're going with all of this. It takes tremendous faith, from my perspective, to believe in the atheistic perspective on life as it addresses cosmological issues, the anthropic issues, the teleological issues, life issues, axiological issues, and I'm sure we'll get into some of this evening. How do we know, though, when something is true? How do you know what I'm saying is true, or Eddie? Here's what we have to do this evening. You're the jury. This is a courtroom. Two positions. Hypothesis up on the wall. God exists. My job, support evidence to persuade the jury, God, man, that guy made sense. That's my job. Eddie's job is to say, oh no, he made more sense. There is no God. You're evaluating both of us looking at a hypothesis. I may jump over to his side if he's persuasive. The best way of doing this is looking at a three-part test for truth. When I make a statement, or Eddie makes a statement, it ought not violate the law of non-contradiction. A does not equal non-A. Hopefully this group understands what I'm saying with that. Secondarily, it needs to fit the facts. The theory, God exists or God doesn't exist, has to fit the facts that we deal with at life. The one that most effectively fits the theory is the one that the needle goes over to that side. And then the third test for truth. We don't determine truth by flipping a coin, or by fighting over it, or by asking our mother what's true. This is a classic logical construct for testing truth. Non-contradiction, fitting the facts, the third test for truth. You as the jury apply to what we say tonight is existential viability. Existential viability. The propositions presented, the premises, reaching the conclusions, have to feel good. They have to have an existential connection in your life. The person who does that most effectively makes the most significant argument to support the thesis, does God exist? Let's have a wonderful time this evening making this happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank the organizers of this debate, and I want to thank Tom for agreeing to debate me on this topic. I will respond to his points in my rebuttal. But in my opening statement, I want to set forth a series of affirmative arguments which will demonstrate why it is far more likely than not that the universe is natural and not supernatural. I will argue that the evidence in our physical universe clearly makes it much more likely than not that a supernatural, self-conscious personality that is an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful deity, the standard issue God of monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, does not exist. My dominant theme will be the lack of evidence of the supernatural and the clear indication from the physical world by way of evidence that the supernatural does not exist. Thus, God is swept away with all supernatural claims. My argument is based upon the weight of the evidence and upon the assertion that atheism is the best inference to be made from the existing evidence. As this debate progresses, I want everybody to please keep in mind the following criteria for assessing the relative strengths of our competing arguments. In order to prevail in this debate, Tom must show that his supernatural explanations are better than naturalistic explanations. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. His burden is the same as one who asserts that it is most likely that the noise in the attic is caused by space aliens from a planet in the Alpha Centauri galaxy. Let's say we've heard substantial commotion in the attic, and each time we inspect the attic, can't find the source of that commotion. The fact that there is undisputed commotion in the attic, along with the fact that we can't determine the causative agencies for this ruckus, still does not justify a leap to a paranormal explanation. This analogy, I argue, applies to all claims of God did it. Tom will also have to show that a supernatural God is a more likely explanation than a non-supernatural explanation for each of the arguments that I'm about to present. Therefore, I'll ask all of you to keep in mind the following question. As both Tom and I present our arguments, whose arguments are more consistent with the observed facts of our physical world, the natural explanation or the supernatural one? And I will also ask you to bear in mind the following proposition. Claims of the paranormal, which all people would otherwise dismiss, are not to be given more credibility just because they are housed in the context of religion. All supernatural claims, all paranormal claims, be it the resurrection of the dead or UFOs, all are to be seen through the same filter. The paranormal and supernatural are seamless, and the fact that a portion of it claims to derive from religious doctrine doesn't give it more credibility. Please keep that in mind as we are taking a uniform exploration of reality. Now, the supernatural. If I told you that here 2,000 years ago in ancient Fort Lauderdale, green gremlins from the sixth dimension abducted members of the native population and imbued them with special powers, and these people are now the guardian angels of the entire United States, and it's because of them that so many people miraculously survive the winters in Buffalo, New York, and the traffic in my native Los Angeles, you wouldn't believe me. Why? Because this violates the laws of nature as we understand those laws, and violates our empirical understanding of how the physical world operates. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Miracles. Claims of miracles have the initial problem of bearing witness against themselves, since by their very nature they are violations of the very laws of nature that are not supposed to be violated. All the supposed miracles that are used to verify, supposedly, the intervention in human affairs of a God allegedly took place in a pre-scientific era. Why not today? Why don't we moderns have the same opportunity to observe these miracles? Talking snakes, talking donkeys, worldwide floods, sun standing still, people being turned into pillars of salt, let Jesus come back, resurrect on worldwide TV. And by the way, the turning of Mrs. Lot into a pillar of salt was particularly cruel on behalf of the Old Testament God because the poor woman was on a low sodium diet. No verifiable event in today's world that corresponds to the types of miracles that monotheistic religions claim happened in ancient times. So, whether it is the resurrection of Jesus or Muhammad being lifted up to heaven on some white horse or something, there is no empirical reason to give one religion's supernatural claim more credence than another. And there is no reason to give religious supernatural claims more credence than all other paranormal claims. So if we went to that lake in Scotland to look for the Loch Ness Monster, that supposedly ancient sea serpent, and we see no evidence and we can't find it, we're not going to say, oh, well, it must become invisible. So if I say that there is an ant in this room, well, you might say that's not something we can determine just by our experience of the world. But if I say there's an elephant in the room, then absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So if we say there's an all-good, all-powerful supernatural being, there should be clear evidence, which we'll get into shortly. We have more evidence that the laws of nature, which a supposed miracle would have to violate, are in fact not violated than we've ever had that a miraculous violation occurred. Thus, the probability that a miracle happened, a violation of natural law, will always be lower than the probability that a miracle has not occurred. Another argument against the existence of God is the dependence of consciousness on the brain. If even Alzheimer's disease destroys the brain. An anesthetic eclipses the brain. How can we say that when we die, the brain pops out the consciousness into an immaterial body? So if you destroy 25% of my brain, you destroy 25% of my consciousness. But if you destroy 100%, I reconstitute fully intact in some astral or soul body. Our very awareness is shaped by interactions with others and the resulting input into a physical brain. So let's say that someone is born and we keep them away from human beings and feed them and hydrate them for 70 years, and they die with no language. Do they pop out into the hereafter speaking a language and able to communicate? If everything we know, the language we speak, the thoughts we have, is because of sensory input into the physical brain, well then, how can there be any awareness or new information brought into consciousness if not by sensory input into an already existing physical brain? Also, if our only models of self-conscious awareness are those with physical brains, and we are indeed made in God's image, then based on the model of consciousness and brains we derive from our own experience as sentient beings, how can we expect to believe in and to conceive of a mind without the attributes of consciousness and our empirical experience? How can we believe in a thinking, willful God when he doesn't have a physical brain? And how can he even think and ponder anything if there are no cortical neurons and synapses, which are components of a functional physical brain that we know are necessary for a conscious process to take place? Also, the argument from evil. In the Bible, God says he can make whatever he wants to happen. In Isaiah 45:7, I make peace and create evil. Why is one child born into a Bangladesh mud hut? Why is another child born into an upscale American neighborhood? There was no benefit to my mother's experiences in Auschwitz. If God wanted to make her stronger, he made her weaker. Maybe we need boot camps to put metal in our character. We don't need concentration camps. The burden of proof is on the theist to show why evil is not fatal to an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God. Malaria is a terrible disease. There is a gene, though, that provides an effective defense against malaria. But if one has inherited the gene from both parents, it results in sickle cell anemia. It's not very good design. God does not adequately comfort suffering and those about to die. So, look at it this way. To explain the horrendous suffering in this world from an all-good and all-powerful God, a theist must argue that God, with his unlimited power, could not have prevented an even greater evil but for the horrible evil he actually caused or allowed, when he could have stopped it if he's all-powerful, or with his unlimited power he could not have brought about a very great good but for actually causing or allowing a horrible evil. If he is omnipotent, if he is all-powerful, it is an almost insurmountable burden for such a supernatural being to be able to say, I'm sorry, but the best I could do is allow this horrendous suffering in order to stop even more suffering. Or there was a good so great, and I couldn't figure out another way of introducing it into the world but by allowing this horrendous suffering. That is not consistent with the being that's all-powerful and all-good. Then there's the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings. Only a few decades of good health and particular physical vigor, and then we decline in illness and old age. That's not what one would expect to find in a living world created by a perfect God. Now, even though believers can believe in evolution, because of its sloppiness and trial and error features, and the wastefulness, with more than 99% of all species that have ever existed being now extinct, it is more likely than not that evolution by natural selection, verified by science, takes place in a universe where it is not being directed by an all-powerful being. And as far as evidence of evolution, there is a 100% match of DNA sequences in the pseudogene region of beta globin between us and gorillas, and that shows we shared a common ancestor. But now, let's have a catch-all argument, the argument from divine hiddenness. Why allow reasonable non-belief? Why play hide and seek with your children? God did not comfort my maternal grandfather as the Nazis were about to shoot her into a pit. God did not comfort my maternal grandfather as he was about to be shoved into the gas chamber at Auschwitz. Why be so inaccessible except by ancient hearsay and by denying us moderns the right to see the same type of miracles? Why not communicate with us directly? Why so many different religions? Why not a simulcast in every language of the world with some guidance as to what we should believe? A supernatural voice booming from the heavens for me to go to some church or synagogue. Turn this podium into green mist. Levitate Tom and me right now to a different realm. Or have the San Diego Chargers win 5 Super Bowls in a row. We see no evidence of miracles. Only the ironclad, predictable laws of nature that betray no actual evidence of the supernatural. Why has God made it so hard to believe in the Bible? Why all the errors? And if the Bible is not the right revelation, what is the right revelation? And this is an additional argument against the existence of God. If there is a God who wants us to know his will, where did he deposit the revelation of that will? If it was not in the Bible, then where was it? And if it is in the Bible, how do you account for all the horrendous defects in the Bible? And the argument from religious confusion. Many Christians disagree on what's necessary for belief. Now, many people in not monotheistic faiths, but the yogis of India and Buddhist meditators spend hours and hours, an entire lifetime meditating, and they don't get the sense of a monotheistic God. They get a sense of a cosmic mush that embraces everybody. So why are different people getting different conflicting impressions from this God? My father was a sincere Orthodox rabbi. He rejected Christianity. Is God going to favor him less than someone who accepts Jesus? When the Dalai Lama dies, will God say, sorry, I tricked you for all your 80 or so years in meditation, now you go to the barbecue pit? I grew up in a traditional Jewish community. We had a saying, if you have 2 Jews, you have 50 opinions. So who's able to determine what's right, what's wrong, and why is God so silent on revealing which religion is true and which religion is not true? Then there's the argument from scale, or the argument from human insignificance. Scientists currently believe that 96% of the universe is either dark matter or dark energy, meaning that a scant 4% of the universe is even conceptually accessible by us. Of that, 4% virtually of it is, most of it is comprised of empty space, some 2 degrees above absolute zero, which is of course instantly lethal to living beings like us. So essentially the universe is off limits to most of humanity. And that which is not off limits, all of that is trying to kill us. And when the sun dies in a few billion years, we will die. The earth will be destroyed. Now consider that our galaxy contains at least 200 billion stars and accompanying solar systems, all of which are inaccessible to us unless we engage in science fiction make-believe and postulate some way to travel above the speed of light. Our galaxy, in turn, is one of more than 100 billion galaxies in the observable universe. And the closest galaxy, Andromeda, is 2.5 million light years away, though it's heading toward us, and in 5 billion years will collide with us. Not very good design. So, why, if there are trillions and trillions of planets in the universe, why would God need all of these trillions of excess debris planets if we are at the core of his creation, or even a significant part of his concern? The universe is 13.8 billion years old. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. We humans have been around for maybe a little more than 100,000 years. So if we are viewed as the center of, or at least a very significant portion of creation, why did God wait so long for us to appear? And why are we only a mere speck of dust? A speck of dust in this room would not be as small as we are in the entire observable cosmos. So the existence of trillions and trillions of planets is not explicable, and the vastness of the universe is not explicable if we are any kind of focus of a being that pays any attention to us. Then there's the argument from incompatible properties. God's omnipotence would conflict with his omniscience. If God is all-knowing, he must know exactly what he will do in the future. If he knows exactly what he will do in the future, then he can never change his mind, because he always knew from the start what he would actually do. So if he knew he would change his mind, it means there really is no change of mind. Because from the very beginning, he always knew ultimately exactly what he would do, because he is omniscient. But if he's omnipotent, he could change his mind. So there is a conflict. Also, if God is omniscient, he knows everything. But if he is omnipotent, he could learn something new. But if he could learn something new until he learns it, he's not omniscient. So therefore, conceptually, the properties of omnipotence and omniscience are contradictory. And as far as the physical universe is concerned, over all these arguments that I have given you as to why naturalism is highly more probable than supernaturalism on the evidence, all of our sciences have made all of the up-to-date predictions and all the discoveries about the universe without recourse to God. If God were an essential component, science wouldn't be able to function. And so if you look at the totality of the universe, if you look at our world, if you look at the evidence of the natural versus the supernatural, and that there has been not one single verified supernatural event in the entirety of human history, then it's far more likely than not that the universe is natural, not supernatural, and that God does not exist. Thank you.
Both speakers will now give a 10-minute rebuttal. Mr. Trento, followed by Mr. Tabash.
Thank you, Eddie. What you saw, folks, is a pretty good closing argument from an attorney. Understand, in a court of law, a closing argument does not have to be factual. It's not evidence. What the attorneys say in their closing arguments are not admissible as evidence. What's presented during the trial is what's admissible as evidence. And I don't know, maybe I got the wrong title for the debate. I thought we were debating, does God exist? Not, God is a jerk. He's done all these crazy things. He's done, Jesus and the Bible's wrong, and the resurrection and aliens coming. We just heard a complaint session on the nature of God, not evidence for the existence of God. I'll change the narrative now to get it back in that direction. But that wasn't what this debate is about. In fact, scribbled a couple of notes as that he was going through his litany of complaints about God. If God is for real, why did he do this? Why did he do that? These are straw man arguments. Edward presents an argument that sounds real. It's a straw man argument. It isn't the argument in its essence that I would hold as a theist or any educated theist would hold. Then he goes to destroy or deconstruct that argument. That's an old process known as straw man arguments. Aliens, we're talking about aliens coming in, and if an alien was in the basement, how does this relate to whether or not God exists? We got into Jesus' resurrection. I'm not here to debate Jesus' resurrection. I will gladly debate that as a topic, but we're here to debate, does God exist? Then we heard the joke about the pillar of salt in the Bible. I didn't even bring a Bible with me. I'm here to present philosophical logical, and scientific evidence that supports the thesis, does God exist? Why are we talking about Jesus? I'll tell you why. When you're a speaker, you psychologically can move an audience any direction you want by forming a narrative that may be off point, which is what you just saw, taking the audience that way to win support for a proposition that isn't the hypothesis right here. If I were the defense attorney speaking to the jury, I'd say what you just heard was an interesting closing argument. It's not evidence, ladies and gentlemen. Then we heard the issue of evil. I'll address that in a second. Bible had errors in it. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That's not the topic for today. How does that relate to the existence of God? I'll tell you, there's such slim support on the atheist side, and I'll shift the narrative right now, for the non-existence, and it's very difficult to prove a negative. We know that in philosophy and logic, but that's his position that he's taken, that you've got to do this straw man stuff and move the audience in the direction you want them to go. I just happen to understand these dynamics in public speaking, and not going to allow that to happen today in this place with you folks right here. What we could have, though, a couple of things he did address that were almost on point. Let's see where we can start here. Paranormal or extraordinary claims need extraordinary support. No, they don't. I am supporting a hypothesis. I will be the first to admit I have a problem as a theist. I wasn't there when all of this started. I have a problem. And I have to exercise at some point this thing called faith. And I'm going to need to define faith for you, and you're going to need to hold Eddie to the same definition if it makes sense. But I have a problem. When I do all my analytical work, all my research, all my investigation, all my logician work, all of that, I go, okay, back at the beginning, I'm moving now toward first causes, because this is where we start tonight in the discussion on the existence of God. Not if there's errors in the Bible, not if Lot and a pillar of salt and a nice joke, straw men stuff. Let's get to the core issues, first causes. I have a problem. I look at how the heck do we get here? I know we're here because we're here, though some philosophers would question that. I know we're here because we're here, and there's other reasons. How did we get here? Remember one of the big questions that you want to manage in your life? There's only two options, and interestingly enough, you have two individuals this evening articulating, espousing, and standing in each of those positions. So, presenting evidence as opposed to straw man, psychological, pop psychological fun stuff, there is either the eternal existence of matter existed eternally, or God existed eternally. No other logical or philosophical possibility. Everybody, when you leave here today, you've got to seriously think, back in the beginning, either this stuff existed eternally, that can be empirically verified, or we are in another dimension. We are in a dimension where something greater than matter exists. Each individual has to place faith in the prime cause, the first cause of all of this stuff. Now the question in terms of our hypothesis, does God exist? Which position makes the most sense? Evidence right now. We know we can empirically verify the material world. We know that. And we know that the material world is finite. That material doesn't spontaneously generate out of nothing in and of itself. Never happened, ain't gonna happen, scientifically verifiable empirically. As much as scientists try to just generate life, not matter, matter coming from nothing. We know in the natural world, matter cannot come from nothing. So Eddie has to exercise evidence in the fact that he's stuck on first causes, having to assume a proposition that will guide his life, assume a proposition that will guide his epistemology, assume a proposition that will guide his ethics, assume a proposition that will guide his death, based upon knowing it's inconsistent with the philosophical position he holds, materialism. Conversely, my problem is, I know I don't have enough faith to place my faith in matter existing eternally. So I got to place my faith in something bigger than that. But on my first cause, this God, as Eddie actually described him properly, my first cause, I go by a self-definition of eternality. And if you struggle with eternality, which you should, tomorrow when you're walking around 12 o'clock in the afternoon, look up in the sky. Tell me where that ends. Tomorrow, look up in the sky at 12 o'clock and tell me where that ends. It doesn't end. Put your finite head around an infinite whatever. But you can live without swallowing your revolver. Me, as a theist, I place faith, trust. Faith is trust, not blind jumping off into space. Based upon the evidence, based upon the comparison, first causes evidence to a system that is inconsistent with its own proposition, I adopt a system that says, okay, Tom, this thing existed eternally. Well, I go, well, that other thing did too. But when you apply science to the other thing, we know it can't generate itself. So there's something bigger. Then I look outside at 12 o'clock and I go, I can't answer where that ends. Maybe there is something bigger than me in this universe. Every atheist in here needs to figure out where the sky ends. Get a handle on that. So I've come over to this side, and that's my starting point. You have to judge which hypothesis, which theory, matter existed eternally, or there's an immaterial component to reality. In that immaterial component, God existed eternally. The only two choices, no fancy foot dancing around that. We're both at a tough position. I don't have enough faith to believe that matter existed eternally. Evidence.
Well, you see, what Tom has done is he has ignored that in my opening statement, I made affirmative arguments against the existence of God based upon the overwhelming evidence that we have naturalism, but we have no evidence of supernaturalism. Discussing miracles, the supernatural, the argument from evil, the argument from religious confusion. These are not straw man arguments. These are not complaints. They are arguments. My arguments about the Bible goes to the question of divine hiddenness and religious confusion. If there is a God who wants us to know his will, then we can expect a reliable revelation. If we don't have a reliable revelation, one that a believer is willing to defend even in a debate, that's evidence of the non-existence of a God, because a God who wants us to believe in him would give us that reliable revelation. Also, Tom did not raise, as he should have, the first cause argument in his opening. He raised it in his rebuttal, which was supposed to be a rebuttal to my arguments, but be that as it may, what Tom is doing is he is, without sufficient evidence, arguing for a supernatural cause outside of space and time, rather than accepting the ambiguity which we naturalists admit exists, but that ambiguity doesn't justify a God of the gaps. For instance, it is far more difficult, even though none of us were back there 13.8 billion years ago, it is more difficult and there is less evidence for a supernatural cause than some natural event, and here's why. The latest understanding we have is that time and space began with the Big Bang. If time and space began with the Big Bang, which even most theistic debaters accept, then you cannot have cause and effect as we understand it, because for A to cause B requires an environment of time and space. So whatever happened, we certainly can surmise that the supernatural explanation is the least likely. But then he contradicted himself. He said, you can't have something come out of nothing, oh, but God can do it. See, that is insufficient because it doesn't have any basis for proof. He is assuming his conclusion. So let's talk about the latest scientific evidence. And Tom is incorrect. It's not just matter always existed or God always existed. And if it came down to it, then matter always existed would be more plausible because we see matter, we have evidence of matter, we have no evidence of God. Now, everything that begins to exist has a cause if it begins within time and space. But the universe did not begin within time and space. Time and space began when the universe began. Also, under classical general relativity, where cause and effect was more certain, but today's top cosmologists are taking the view, those that don't have a religious bias, that the universe could sooner come from nothing than come from a supernatural, magical being who made it out of nothing. This way, under quantum mechanics, subatomic particles, we know, even in our causal environment, can come into existence and go out of existence without cause. And such scientists as Alexander Vilenkin talk about the decay of the nuclear atom, and talk about the universe literally coming from nothing. And if a theist says, how can something come from nothing? It is still not as improbable as a magical being generating something from nothing. It only takes the mystery one step backward. So if you have a vacuum with a quantum fluctuation, and from that you have what's known as quantum tunneling, which leads to what has been verified by the WMAP and the Planck satellite, the inflation, which ends in a Big Bang. That is more credible because it's a natural explanation than a supernatural explanation. Remember, these are not me standing on a mountaintop, as Thomas characterizes, railing against God, saying, you should do this rather than that, and I'm angry at you. No, these are arguments using reason and logic to say if an all-powerful, all-knowing supernatural being existed, these are what we could expect. But the greatest mystery, which makes it tougher on Tom than on me, even though I don't yet have all the answers, is his God of the Gaps argument, where he says, we don't understand yet what happened, therefore God did it. So I want you to all ponder this. The most difficult and the explanation with the least evidence is that a magical being that is immaterial and outside space and time jump-started space and time. We have no way of understanding or even conceptualizing how an immaterial being outside of space and time can cause or do anything, and Tom did not refute in his rebuttal my argument that consciousness is dependent on the physical brain and that we can't have a being without a physical brain who could think. Tom also didn't refute my argument that evolution is more likely on atheism. Tom also didn't refute my argument that the evidence cuts against miracles. He didn't refute my argument that an all-powerful, all-good God would not be expected to allow so much evil. He didn't deal with my argument about the incompatible properties of omniscience and omnipotence. He didn't deal with my article about the scale of the universe and human insignificance in it and all the unnecessary debris. And he mentioned a teleological argument in his opening statement, but didn't develop it. Well, first of all, if the universe had to be fine-tuned, it's a non-starter for theists, because if God is all-powerful, God could make us live in any environment. So why would God have to even adjust the laws of physics and the parameters? Also, Tom said that his faith is based on trust. Well, he didn't sufficiently develop that because he doesn't have enough evidence, no one does, to make the leap from blind faith to trust that a supernatural being did anything. Also, in terms of the cosmological parameters of the universe, one of the theories that is now most indicated by the inflationary theory, which has been confirmed by the Planck satellites, the WMAP satellites, and all the other scientific data from outer space, is that of bubble universes like ours forming indefinitely because of inflation ending in individual Big Bangs. Well, if there are multiple such universes, which is still more arguably true because they're natural, not supernatural, then in a multiplicity of universes, each one could have different cosmic parameters, and if there's a large enough number, there is no mystery that ours might have just the right ones. But again, if God is all-powerful, God could have made us live in water. Now, he talked about Pascal's wager. That again is a non-starter argument, because if I say to you, unless you believe in my God who is going to require you to worship an orange and an apple every day, you will suffer eternally. Well, I have to first show you evidence. You're not required to believe that because of that outside chance. And also, when Tom indicated by adopting Pascal's wager that if there is a supernatural being, he will punish us either by annihilation or eternal separation just because we don't believe in him, we have a right to say, wait a minute, that's unfair. We have a right to use our reason as logical, compassionate human beings to argue that an all-powerful, all-good being would understand that he didn't give us enough evidence and treat us and determine our eternity by how we treat others, not by whether we worshiped him. That's just turning God into a cosmic egomaniac. So Tom basically failed to grapple with the substantive, scientific, and logical arguments I made in my opening statement. He dropped the ball on responding to them specifically, and he has done nothing to demonstrate, and this is the most important thing, that the supernatural is more likely than the natural. That's why on the probabilistic scale, the weight of the evidence is still that it's far more likely than not that there is no God, that the universe is natural, not supernatural.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now here is the structure for the next module of the debate. Each speaker will ask questions of the other speaker. We'll start with Tom. He will have 1 minute to phrase a question in order to ask Eddie. Eddie will then have 2 minutes to respond to that question. Tom will ask 3 consecutive questions, at which point we will shift perspective, and Eddie will ask 3 consecutive questions, which he will have 1 minute to make the question, and Tom will have 2 minutes to answer the question. After this point, we will take a brief pause as pens and index cards will be passed out throughout the auditorium, and I will take your questions, and I will organize them, and I will do my level best to make sure that each speaker gets an equal amount of questions. And since I am going to do that, I will apologize now, and I will apologize later. I very much doubt that every question will be answered. I can hope, but I thank everyone for using their neurons to give us very good questions. So we will begin. Mr. Trento?
Where do we go?
Up here.
You will
Only one mic.
We have only one
Oh,
mic.
okay.
So you will have 1 minute to phrase your question, and
Why don't I
then
stand here and then I'll...
however you two feel comfortable. Sure.
Okay. First question, Eddie. My observations, speaking to a lot of atheists through the years, is there's many of them moved toward atheism because of a bad experience with God, and then there was a doubting of God, and then they moved on to start studying and then confirm that. And my question, I've heard you speak a few times, and you talk about your dad who was an Orthodox rabbi. That's no small thing. That's a real believer in God. Was your mom, by any chance, who the Auschwitz survivor, a theist?
Not afterwards.
No, I mean during that. No? Okay. How usually parents transfer their their belief in God to their children. What happened with your Orthodox rabbi dad that you didn't adopt his understanding of theism?
What happened with my Orthodox rabbi dad is when I was born, he stopped being a rabbi and was still involved in the Jewish community, but expressed many doubts. And what happened was he kept telling me that he wanted me to remain within the fold, and because people had suffered so much for it. And when he was in his 80s, he died at the age of 89, I said, Dad, is God all-powerful? And he said, he's supposed to be. I said, then what about the Holocaust, the death of your family, the death of Mom's family? And he said, well, that cannot be explained. And I said, how come miracles don't happen now and they happen then? He said, that cannot be explained. So toward the end of his life, he called himself an agnostic. But what's important is you have to understand how people like me become atheists. We don't become atheists out of emotion. We become atheists out of examining the evidence. If you say to me, Eddie, let's build this bridge, and I say, we need 2 pillars to hold it up, and you say we need 1, but it seems to me from the evidence that bridges with 1 pillar falls down, I'll become an exponent of 2 pillars, but that is because of the evidence. Because the universe has always appeared to me to be natural, not supernatural. Because miracles don't occur today. Because there is no evidence that there is anything other than the natural. That's how I became an atheist, and it doesn't matter what my upbringing is, because true intellectual seeking means that we adopt what appears true to us irrespective of what we have learned from our ancestral background.
Your second question, Mr. Chair?
Okay. The second question deals with the concept of truth. And if, Eddie, your worldview is naturalistic, then truth obviously isn't a concept that stands outside of your neurons. And if truth is conditioned to the brain, and it becomes a part of natural selection and survival of the fittest, for truth, that which is good and just and right, to turn to what we would consider evil as a result of our brains moving that direction, how then would you ever know what right or wrong or good or evil is? It's just a mere function of the brain.
Well, we certainly would have, we atheists, a better shot at it than the theist, because you see, the theist response to the argument from evil is the unknown purpose defense, which is that nothing is wrong if God ordains it. Well, if nothing is wrong if God ordains it, there's no way of knowing right or wrong, because you first have to check to see if God ordained it. So initially, the theist already has the worst problem. Certainly, the beauty that you speak of, or the love of others, can exist even if we don't believe in God, because the proof is there are many of us who don't believe in God and see these things. But if I'm supposed to take the beauty of the universe, of the world, and say, this means there must be a God, with all the countervailing evidence of evil and suffering, that would countermand it. In fact, if you have a random mix of good and evil, that would seem what you would expect on naturalism. And in terms of a moral compass, this is what we derive through human experience, and you will find, as you agree with me at least on one aspect, the more people move away from religious fundamentalism, the more kindly they are to others and others with differing views. So there is no factual reason why we must fabricate a supernatural being in order to ground in that being some notion of right and wrong.
Okay. You didn't answer my question, which was, if the brain moved in a direction where truth became evil for natural selection, would that be acceptable as a new dynamic in life? But we'll deal with that maybe later on. The question I have for you right now is teleological question in terms of evidence for this hypothesis up here. How does order in the world, and there are 120 various constants that keep everything moving in the right direction, and the argument, Paley's watchmaker argument, if you find a Rolex watch on the ground with diamonds, do you assume that through the various effects of nature, that watch came together, or was there a designer behind that? How does a naturalist look at the design in the world and conclude that design came out of chaos and random disorder?
The way a naturalist does that is by turning Paley's argument against him. If you find a watch on the ground, you know it was created by humans, not by a deity. But if you see a natural structure, an animal or a tree or a rock or beautiful scenery, you don't have the same notion, aha, an intelligent person, an intelligent being did that. So we automatically distinguish between human intelligent created artifacts and natural phenomenon in the world. And as far as the teleology of order, well, most of the universe is lethal, and in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, which says that disorder and entropy increases in time, that's only in a closed system. But the universe is accelerating, and our region of the universe is not a closed system. So there's no reason to think that our existence on this planet, that's not in a test tube, but in a still accelerating universe as the galaxies move away from each other, is in a closed system. So the second law of thermodynamics is not violated. And the first law of thermodynamics at the beginning of the universe with positive and negative energy in balance is not violated. So in that sense, and also evolution by natural selection, which I argued and so far has gone unrefuted, shows how random selection can result in order. And if you understand the evolution of the universe, the Big Bang, and the 13.8 billion years that it took for the universe to get to where it is today, there's no reason to see a supernatural hand.
Okay, so Mr. Tabash,
Okay.
you have your minute to frame your question for Mr. Trento.
Okay. Tom, Steve Hawking has postulated a no-boundary quantum cosmology, which would erase an absolute beginning point for the universe, leaving us with a universe with no edge in space and no beginning in time. Remember, as I said, time and space began with the Big Bang, prompting Carl Sagan to say there's nothing for a creator to do. How would you answer Steve Hawking and Carl Sagan?
Well, Carl Sagan, his primary cosmological perspective on life, as you well know, was panspermia, one of the ideas that he presented back in the 80s. And for those unfamiliar with panspermia, it's a perfect illustration of the dilemma, the paradox I laid out early on in terms of supporting the hypothesis from a naturalistic perspective. If the naturalistic worldview doesn't provide answers for first causes and doesn't answer teleology properly, and you didn't answer my teleological question, when the Rolex watch was there, intelligence, not a human, but intelligence was necessary, which when you look at the human eye, 7 zillion times more complex than a Rolex watch. Where did that come from? Natural selection, when you need 2 eyes to work? But panspermia, back to Carl Sagan for a moment, was his leap, as Hawkins has leapt with this theory, was his leap at how life began here from an evolutionary purpose. And Carl Sagan's panspermia was very simple. He said, quoting, aliens delivered sperm from other galaxies to the United States, and those seeds of sperm generated our Earth, our galaxy, and life forms from that. So I find the naturalistic view of Hawkins, who's been all over, he comes up with one theory after another in his obviously necessary restrictions to consider immaterial. You make fun of it, of a magic guy and all of that. We're talking serious philosophy about an immaterial world. When Stephen Hawking can't allow an immaterial explanation, then he's stuck with just his de jure explanation of cosmology. He's had 3 or 4 of them over the past 30 years.
Well, that leads into my next question, because we know the difference between the scientist and the religionist is the scientist will change their view based on the evidence. And that's why Stephen Hawking shows he's an empiricist, because he changes his view, but always becomes more natural. So the question is this: if there is a supernatural explanation, Tom, for how the universe came about, tell us how God did it.
Good question. I don't know how God did it. I have no idea. No idea how God started the universe. And I found that you can speculate, you can have nice conversations with friends and opponents and figure out, oh, you know, he could have done this, that, the other thing. But basically, the philosophers have come down on the fact that of all the possible worlds that could be created, this is the best possible world. And taking it a step further, of all the options God had in creating humans, he could have created them only in one of 3 ways, Eddie. He could have created them, he could have not created them. He could have created the existence as we know it out of time, space, and matter, and never created humans, going to your evolutionary view. He could have created, actually axiological view, he could have created humans that were automatons, that necessarily did his will perfectly every second of the day. He could have done that. That's a philosophical possibility. Or he could have created human beings with a free will. And the philosophers historically, by the way, about 90% of the world's population ever are theists. About 10% have moved toward atheism. So it's just an interesting dynamic. But if he created a human being, Eddie, with free will, the ability to choose right or wrong, and then as the philosophers and theologians have said for thousands of years, within that freedom of a human being to express themselves as they choose, with a father, just like a father at home, hoping their child does the right thing, when they choose to do wrong, often it's evil, and that's where the problem of evil comes from, and I'd be glad to talk about that.
Well, Tom, if in fact there is free will, why is it of such a value? A human parent wouldn't let one child push another off the cliff just for free will. Why should God allow so much free will as to allow us to do such damage to each other? And we all know people who are highly, highly moral, people who are better than other people. They have free will. Why couldn't God have created people with free will, but more of the good ones than those who will harm another person?
Okay, this is a very good discussion regarding the hypothesis, does God exist? 2 theories. And I don't know what your theory is. We obviously have free will. And I just laid out before that there are only 3 options. No humans, humans that are essentially ethical robots, or humans with free will. Now your question didn't challenge the fact that humans have free will. That's empirically verified. We can see that every day by making a decision. So I'm not quite sure I understand your question, but I think I got it. If a human being like Adolf Hitler chooses to adopt a particular philosophy, and that philosophy results in the destruction of millions of people, he chose to do that, and a nation chose to support him, and a war was fought over that, because objectively, people understand that you may have the right to exercise your free will, but when your free will violates these objective laws, and Thomas Jefferson called them natural laws, and he said that they come from providence and they're unalienable. A lot of atheists like to quote Thomas Jefferson. Go read the United States Constitution. When free will is exercised at times, horrible things occur. But in terms of theism, which is what we're debating, when you compare the activity and action of a free will agent against the dictates and designs and desires of a theistic God, at least in a Christian context, it's completely antithetical to what God wants, and thus ultimate judgment at some point. Makes a lot of sense. How does a naturalist account for evil if God doesn't exist?
Each question will be asked. The first answer will be Mr. Trento. He will have 2 minutes to respond to that question. Afterwards, Mr. Tabash will have 2 minutes to respond as he sees fit. Then, the next question will be asked to Mr. Tabash. He'll have 2 minutes to respond to that question, and then Mr. Trento will respond for 2 minutes as he sees fit. Logically, we have a table full of ideas, and this is what's left in my hand. And I don't think we're going to even get through this. But thank you very much for helping us with this. I greatly appreciate this. So, for the first question, for Mr. Trento, you stated that you had scientific proof of God's existence. Where is the scientific proof? Please specify. You have 2 minutes.
I would never make this statement. If I did, we have to check the record, that I have scientific proof of God's existence. In the sense that God is immaterial, and the science world, unless we're doing pop science, pseudoscience, as often happens, the scientific world can't prove that Abraham Lincoln existed or that George Washington existed. You can't bring that into a laboratory and empirically verify. I see people going like this. Look at the definition of the pure doctrine of scientific validation. Needs to be repeatable, needs to be empirical. Once you go outside the boundaries of what classic science evaluation and investigation is, you move into pop science, you move into pseudoscience, and you're functioning as a philosopher, not as a scientist. So in that sense, God cannot be proven scientifically, but the scientific evidence leads to the hypothesis God exists more effectively than the other side. In particular, I don't understand atheism. Atheism is an arrogant philosophical position that says, I have a finite mind and I know all the knowledge in the world, and I know indisputably that there is no God. To me, that is a frightening position to hold. And, okay, I thought you already showed me the end of the one. So I need Eddie to explain to me how an atheist can maintain philosophical integrity by saying, I know there's no possibility of God existing. Now, if he can do that, look at the trap he's put himself in. He said, no matter what you present, Trento, or anybody else, I can't accept it because I live in this iron box.
Except that's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the overwhelming weight of the evidence makes it more likely than not that God does not exist. I'm not speaking in absolute terms. We are making probabilistic arguments. What I'm saying is that the absence of evidence for the supernatural and all the evidence that we have from the natural world makes it more likely than not that God does not exist. And I've always said I'm open to the evidence. I said throughout tonight that if evidence of a supernatural God were to present itself to me, I would change my views. Now, the important point here is Tom just said we don't know that Abraham Lincoln lived, but you see, we're talking about the empirical method. Even outside of the hard sciences, as long as we don't have violations of the natural order, we know very well Abraham Lincoln lived more than we know which religion is true and more than we know whether God exists or not. We know President Kennedy was assassinated 50 years ago, more than we know that God exists, more than we know which religion is true. So the empirical method generally can be relied upon if there is corresponding evidence to show such things happened. We know there are presidents of the United States. We know there have been assassinations. We know there was a civil war. But to say that Lincoln was assassinated, or the sun stood still, or a dead man was resurrected, or a snake talked, those are outside what we know to be true. But we do know mundane historical things to be true. So the empirical is what we're speaking about here. And again, there's no way I made an absolutist statement. I'm saying the overwhelming weight of the evidence from our physical universe makes it more likely than not that God does not exist.
All right. Question 2 for Mr. Tabash initially. How can you explain such things as love, thoughts, perception, parentheses, things that are not of the material world, but we believe exist? Touch upon the existence of non-existence or non-existence of a soul.
Well, if you heard my argument that consciousness is dependent upon the physical brain, then we can't have souls, because if even an anesthetic or Alzheimer's disease eclipses a brain, or an anesthetic eclipses consciousness, and if we see that damage to the brain damages consciousness, and all we know is what we learn through sensory input into the physical brain, and we only have consciousness when there's a functional cortical neurons and synapses, then it falls to the theist to explain how upon death, conscious awareness and memory fully intact transforms itself into an immaterial body. And if there are souls, how do we know where one soul ends and the other begins if we're not material? And also, without physical bodies, do we see all the way around our heads? Do we see in the back of our head? What are our sensory perceptions without physical senses and a physical body? And with respect to love and beauty and caring, we're able to do those things because we exist as physical beings. There is no evidence whatsoever that there is a consciousness that is disembodied, that is capable of expressing love or appreciating beauty. Now, the fact that certain abstract concepts exist doesn't mean that there can be disembodied intelligences. We know of numbers and mathematical concepts, but you can translate them. The number 2 can be an abstraction, then I hold up 2 fingers. So the fact that we can conceptualize lofty ideals with our physical brains doesn't mean that consciousness of recognition and self-awareness can persist if there is no physical brain.
We have a headline tonight, folks. Headline to leave with. My friend Eddie Tabash converts to agnosticism. And we have the record. You as an atheist, Eddie, can never say you are open to being persuaded differently and maintaining the integrity of atheism. Atheism is a definitive, unless we're going to now start playing with the English language. Atheism is a definitive position that says, go to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, a denial or complete disbelief in God. It's an absolute disposition. Those of you shaking your head out there, it's philosophically uncomfortable, but it's factually true, which is your existential crisis when you try to assume a position that has an illogical component to it. Number 2, I never said we can't test whether or not Abraham Lincoln died. I said you can't test it scientifically. Of course you can use empiricism and circumstantial evidence, which is exactly what we do to support the thesis God exists. Regarding the concepts of love and justice and truth, death knell, absolutely death blow to materialism. You can squawk all you want and say, these things come out of goo in my head. Well, if the goo in your head changes, as it did in 1938, and a bunch of people said it's okay to kill others, as is happening right now, babies' throats being slit in Syria in justification for a belief system. If there isn't something immaterial that stands above that, then it's impossible philosophically, emotionally, and Eddie argues quite well emotionally, but philosophically it's impossible to critique any behavior if truth flows out of your brain and isn't removed outside of the material world.
Okay. Mr. Trento. Someone want my guy.
Okay.
Do you think that Neanderthals are in heaven or hell? In other words, were they subject to his will?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would speculate, and my speculation would not be, it would be completely off the cuff. I have never thought of whether a Neanderthal was in heaven or hell or not. Interesting question. I have no opinion on that.
Well, actually, he should have an opinion on it because he talked about there being Pascal's wager and he talked about there being a judgment for evildoers. So what he has to do is he has to define what are the limits of when we get judged or when we don't get judged, and it's up to the theist to point out when somebody should be judged and when not, and what level of consciousness they're supposed to have. Now, insofar as atheism being absolute is concerned, it's only absolute now, but that doesn't mean forever if there's new evidence. I could turn this around and say Tom isn't a real believer in God because he says he would change his mind if new evidence came about. So the fact that we are taking strong positions based on the evidence up to this moment in time doesn't mean anything. And the question, again, for the theist is, okay, Neanderthals are not to be judged, but Hitler is to be judged. How about Einstein, who disbelieved in a personal God? And what if you violate Pascal's wager? What if you say, well, you know what, God, there's not enough evidence for you, so I'm not going to believe in you. I'll just be good to others. Does God say, I'm going to judge you adversely anyway? You see, Tom didn't flesh out what exactly the full force and effect of Pascal's wager would be, even if it's true. Pascal said, well, you have to believe in God or you'll be punished. Pascal didn't say, well, why don't you just be good to others and that itself will be sufficient. Just don't be bad to others. Take a risk that way. No, it was based on punishment for belief or lack of belief.
Question for Ed. I believe we have some Descartes here. Cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Is the converse true? I think not, therefore I am not.
Well, if the mind can no longer think, then you are not, even if you don't have the awareness to know you can't think. So, for instance, I think, therefore I am. Right now, I have a conception of myself because my brain is operative. If somebody were to come in here right now and shoot me through the head with an AK-47, I would no longer be thinking that I'm an aware thinking individual, which is evidence that consciousness is dependent on the brain. See, the mistake that the theists are making here is to think that because the brain functions, that the consciousness that we have because of a functional brain would persist even if the brain did not function, but all the evidence is to the opposite. Otherwise, people with Alzheimer's disease would say, oh yes, this part of my brain has been eroded, but I still have all these memories. And so even in brain surgery now, when they touch certain parts of the brain, certain memories are triggered. And if you destroy certain parts of the brain, certain memories are lost. So if you have a piano prodigy and that part of the brain gets damaged, if consciousness and memory is not dependent on the physical brain, that person should be able to still maintain their skills as a piano player. Amnesia should be impossible if consciousness is not dependent upon the brain. So all the evidence we have to date up to this moment in time shows that consciousness cannot persist without a physical brain.
The subheadline for today is, my friend Eddie tries to validate his atheist position by saying, up to this second I'm an atheist, but it can change tomorrow. Not good enough, Eddie, not good enough for me. You are either an atheist and that is your position. If you allow for your position to be changed, there's another term for that. And we all know what that other term is, and it's the intellectually more honest position to claim to be an agnostic, one who doesn't have sufficient information to reach the definitive conclusion that God does not exist. So Eddie, you fail miserably in defending your atheist position philosophically, as does that question. That question logically and philosophically collapses upon itself. Read it once again, Alan.
No problem. Ergo, cognito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is the converse true? I think not, therefore I am not.
I think not, because I am not. This is the struggle that we theists have with materialists, atheists, and people that are more oftentimes emotionally driven. He thinks not, therefore he is not. Tell me how you think not without thinking. This person is sitting on a limb, sawing the limb off as they're articulating the question, which is one of the fatal flaws of atheism, and you see it articulated right there. He has to think to phrase the question, so by his own statement of the question, he contradicts what he's trying to accomplish. Happens all the time. Eddie, I'm not letting you off the hook, my friend. Are you an atheist or are you an agnostic?
Question for Tom. Why doesn't God cure amputees? I believe it's a website.
Why doesn't God cure amputees? I don't know. My God doesn't cure amputees. Why doesn't he cure my, I got a bad arm. I mean, I don't know why he doesn't cure amputees. But I do know this. I do know that not only from, now understand folks, I got a little problem here. I've come to very specifically argue theism, just that God exists. He could be an evil God. You don't know what kind of God I believe in. He could be a demented God. All I'm arguing is God exists. If we want to move into the nature of God and all of that, I'd be glad to do that, in a full-fledged debate. But out of respect for the question, I do know this. I do know that my discipline, Christianity, teaches that often evil can be seen, and injuries and all of that, can be seen and applied in a unique way that makes an individual stronger. I was seriously injured in my life and almost became a quadriplegic at one point in my life. Spent a month in a hospital. And, you do question God, and that was many years ago. And as a result of my personal injury, I have developed a deeper, stronger, more vital relationship with God, understand how pain and injury and suffering can purify, just like a fire purifies gold, can purify an individual. And but I didn't at that point in my life reject God. I understood there's a bigger picture here. So in that sense, maybe he's not healing the amputee, the physical part, but maybe he's working on his soul, his spirit, to make him a much better person that can impact more people in his life than if he just had an extension of his limb.
Well, you see, the problem here is that Tom has just admitted that you can't call anything bad if you believe in his God, because there's an unknown purpose, and that means Tom can't call anything good or bad. Now, as far as, let me turn the tables on Tom. To say that to be an atheist, I have to say I'm closed to evidence. No, to be anything is what you are to date. If I were to say future evidence means that I would not change my mind, then I would be dogmatic. Let me turn it on Tom. If Tom is going to say that nothing would change his mind about God's existence, then he's being dogmatic and closed-minded. But if he's going to insist that he would change his view based on evidence, and I can accuse him of being agnostic, because then his theism is only tentative. The fact that we believe firmly what we believe up to now doesn't mean we're not what we say we are. The fact that we are open to evidence. So therefore, if I say today I'm a welfare capitalist, I believe in the free enterprise system, but with social concern for the government, and then next year I become a socialist, that doesn't mean I'm a socialist today. It just means that later evidence changed my mind. If I say I'm a Jew today until I see further evidence, but then 3 years from now you find me in Buddhist robes, that doesn't mean I wasn't fully a Jew today. If I say I'm an atheist today, and then all of a sudden you find me with 50 wives in Utah becoming a Mormon, that doesn't mean I wasn't an atheist today.
I'm not getting any ideas. The responses are so good that I'm literally knocking questions out from my stack and having to choose new ones. Question for Ed.
Oh, was that his question?
Can a not quite perfect God be the simplest and best explanation?
No, because even an imperfect God, you have to overcome the question of how an immaterial being can affect matter, and then we have to define the parameters of the imperfection. Is he just a super powerful but not all powerful klutz that goes, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to be that bad? Is he why did he have to give us cancer on this planet? Why did he have to give us leukemia? Why do we have to have storms? Why earthquakes? Why all those viruses running around? And also, if God is a perfect being, any imperfection in the design, like my digestive system, is an example of the lack of perfection. So if the theist says, like Tom is trying to retreat, saying, I'm not saying what kind of God is, if he's good or evil, I'm just saying there's a God. He can't hide behind he can't hide behind the curtain like that, because inherent in the definition of God is all-powerful, all-good, or all-knowing. And if Tom wants to argue that his God doesn't have to necessarily be all good, then he needs to say it, and then he can't make the argument he just made that even the severe injury he had faith it was for a larger purpose. Because if the God he believes in is not all good, it might have been that that God was evil and said, I'm going to hurt Tom, I'm going to hurt this person, I'm going to hurt that person. He can't artificially trim down the God he really believes in just so he has a lesser puzzle to defend in a debate.
Now, Mr. Trento, I have been asked to repeat the question.
Okay.
So to repeat the question, can a not quite perfect God be the simplest and best explanation?
Can a not quite perfect God be the simplest and best explanation to the existence of God? Well, of course. If we're arguing within the parameters of the hypothesis, does God exist? Sure, that's a possibility that a flawed and failed God could be possible. It's not the position I hold. But it would support the fact that God exists. Now, understand, I'm arguing very specifically a very unique thesis, or hypothesis, I should say. Does God exist? I didn't get into the nature of God, not because of Eddie's, Tom's doing this and that. The God that I articulate is the Judeo-Christian God, who is an all-good God, who allows, as much as that may fit the philosophical criteria for an answer, it's not sufficient to explain the type of God I believe in. And that God had, as I said earlier, a couple of options. Create no one, create robots, or free will. Once you open free will up, evil comes into the world apart from God, even though he knew it would happen, just like a father handling a child knowing he's going to do wrong. But folks, if I'm right and God exists, this is just one chapter in a very long book. And maybe all of this stuff will be put in order at some point. Eddie, you still have not convinced me, or many people in here, that you are an atheist. You argue that, if things change, I am a theist, but I'm open to change. But theism doesn't necessitate an absolutist position that says you've got to believe in God all the time, whereas atheism doctrinally does. I'm not allowing you, Eddie, to say that you're an atheist, but you're open to change. And the books, the philosophy books and the dictionaries don't allow that, Eddie. You can't have it both ways.
So, Tom?
Oh, I'm up.
Your opening statement was, my belief is based on personal experience. What is your personal experience of eternity?
Okay. Actually, I said that my belief is based upon the evidence I've examined and confirmed by experience. Very important to put that in the right order. I advocate against switching those, letting your experience determine the evidence. And sadly, I see that with atheists. My experience, I mean, I was standing next to Madeline Mary O'Hare in 1986 to debate her in Colorado, and she wound up not wanting to do that. And her son John didn't want to do that at that point. And ironically, I'm going to Israel in a couple of weeks with her son Bill Murray. Interesting. But I have seen, in my experience with atheists, their experience provides the template for the interpretation of the evidence. Mine is just the opposite. I look at the evidence. And when it comes to eternity, we know there is an eternity. We know there was a start to our existence, the material end. But what happened 1 second before time and space and matter occurred, and go outside if you want a sense of eternity tomorrow at 12 o'clock and look up in the sky and tell me where it ends. It's eternal. So physical experience, standing outside, looking up, validates eternality. When I look at the theistic or Christian doctrines that talk about afterlife, they make much more sense than Bertrand Russell's A Banquet for the Worms on many levels. And as a result, I put my trust in the fact, based upon evidence, not blind faith, based upon evidence, biblical evidence, experiential evidence, that eternity exists, and I want to be ready for it.
Well, the fact that you look up at the sky and can't see the end, and the fact that the universe may go on eternally, which we don't know, doesn't mean that we are eternal or immortal. The fact that the physical reality of the universe had a beginning, which we agree on, and that time and space didn't pre-exist it, so we can't define the cause, particularly a supernatural one, and the fact that Tom can look at the sky doesn't mean that we survive death. It doesn't answer the arguments that I raised about the dependence of consciousness on the brain. Also, Tom has completely gone off the cliff on this one, saying that a theist has a right to say, I'll change my mind and still be a theist, but an atheist doesn't. There's absolutely no intellectual justification for not allowing the atheist the open-mindedness to change their position down the road, but saying, oh, but the theist can do that. So Tom is the agnostic, because Tom is saying that if he gets evidence against God, he would change his mind because he's open. Well, again, the fact that I'm an atheist today doesn't mean I have to be one 50 years from now, but that does not delegitimize that I'm an atheist today. What Tom is trying to do is to trick me into saying nothing would change my mind in order to validate being an atheist, but he has no empirical, epistemological right to do that, because what he is saying is, Eddie, in order to be a bona fide atheist, you have to say you're close to the evidence. No, that's the problem with religious. We atheists always admit that we would be open to new evidence, and that's the difference between the scientific empirical method and the religious dogmatic method.
Next question, Mr. Tabash. If the question is, how can God, since he is believed to have control over everything, allow atrocities to occur, does that then mean that you don't believe other forces exist, such as the devil, and that human choice plays no factor in the evil that exists?
Well, first of all, as I said, I believe in naturalism, not supernaturalism, so God is just one more disembodied that is cut away by naturalism. So if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in a devil, because my form of metaphysical and scientific naturalism actually is based upon there being no disembodied entities, which includes God, the devil, miniature gods, spirits, ghosts, you name it, they all don't exist. And so, yes, human choice does play a role, but then again, why is that so valuable? Why should God say, I'm going to let even Hitler get away with it? Why couldn't God have caused Hitler to have a heart attack or be killed in prison, or that assassination attempt to go through? Why does God intervene in stopping some evils but not others? If God exists, God has to explain, well, I only allowed this evil to happen, I allowed the Holocaust, but I didn't allow that evil to happen. I allowed 1.5 million Armenians to be killed by the Ottoman Empire in 1915, 6 million Jews by Hitler in the 1940s. But you see, I stopped this atrocity. I didn't let this happen in Bosnia. I didn't let that go too far in Rwanda. It's inexplicable. And I'm saying that as rational beings, we would have a right to know the answer, and based on divine hiddenness, a God that withholds from us his reasons for doing these things, that yet wants relationship with us, is far more likely not to exist than to exist.
Once again, Eddie, my understanding of theism is unrelated to your position publicly as an atheist. It's irrelevant what I believe or what I don't believe. Your atheism isn't contingent upon me believing a particular way. You have to leave here today and you have to present yourself publicly as an atheist, regardless of what Tom Trento does. I could die on the way home. You still have to deal with the fact that you've adopted an agnostic position. I am unaware of the distinction you're making between your definition of atheism and the classic definition of agnosticism. It's not bad, Eddie, to come on over. Maybe you can't be in the atheist club anymore, but it's not bad. You can start your own agnostic club, to come over and say, at this point I don't have enough information, but I'm open-minded because that's what you're telling me. Now, in being precise about the question, there are theists that do not believe in the devil. So the proposition here, and the hypothesis was, does God exist? These questions are dealing more with the classic Judeo-Christian. Does the Judeo-Christian God exist, which is the one I hold to? Yes, there is a devil. There is an evil entity that exists in this world and is present. And it's if you buy into the two difficulties in the beginning, materialism and immaterialism, you got to buy into one. If you buy into the immaterial world, then there becomes a template to explain some of the evil that's in the world that's propagated by other entities. And I know for materialists this is very difficult simply because you're locked in that box of not looking at these issues. But the issue still, Eddie, I need to know, are you coming over to agnosticism or what? And if you want me to admit I'll be a Christian agnostic, that's fine, I admit it. Will you admit that you're an agnostic now?
Ladies and gentlemen, I am heartbroken at the questions we will not be able to ask. Personally, for me, the next one involved dinosaurs, and I am sad that we will not have time for that. You know, I taught paleontology for 3 years. But if you've enjoyed what's come before, I think you're going to enjoy what's going to happen next. We have two 12-minute closing statements. Now, as agreed upon by the coin flip at the beginning of the debate, the person who spoke first will not give the closing statement. This is a classic debate technique because if you speak first and you speak last, there's an unfair advantage to the minds of the audience. So, Mr. Trento will give his closing 12 minutes first, and then Mr. Tabash will end the debate with his 12 minutes, and I will have a few things to say before I let you loose upon the world tonight.
Thank you, Alan and Eddie and Sarah, for a wonderful evening. And the bottom line is, as I said at the outset, this is some very serious stuff. And we joke around a little bit, I think because the weight of the material is so serious. From my perspective, from the theistic perspective, the weight of the material has eternal consequences, eternal ramifications. Now, as easy as it may be to dismiss a theistic view of life, even a Judeo-Christian view of life, as easy as it may be to dismiss that, we all come back to Pascal's wager in a sense. Just in the bare skeleton, just the bare bones, Pascal simply said that, hey folks, you got 50-50 either way. So just that, the weight of that alone ought to reinvigorate those of you who are materialists or atheists to say, Eternity is a long time, and maybe there needs to be a reconsideration. Well, that reconsideration is over against the hypothesis for this evening. The hypothesis we put up on that board was, does God exist? And the starting point, and Eddie raised many arguments, the brain argument. I think that's a silly argument. You need a brain, how can you have a spirit, how can you have thoughts? It's a silly argument, simply because if the proposition, the material world exists, it's de facto a priori immaterial, and it has an existence that has intelligence and vitality to it, if indeed that theory is true. So to counter the theory by saying, where's the brain and the soul, is a silly argument. And so I didn't, you can't waste a lot of time with some of these things. But in terms of the hypothesis, we have first causes. My argument is very clear. The materialist knows that material doesn't come from nothing. So he has a tremendous amount of faith to put in the fact that the material that we see and test empirically came from nothing, when all the experiments, with all the great labs and scientists, prove that you can't get material from nothing. So he lives on a foundation of sand. Eddie does, a materialist do, an atheist do, that simply says, I know I could never accept how I start my understanding of life in fulfilling and living out my life, but I will close my mind to that and charge ahead and try to make sense out of all of this. Conversely, I have a problem with how did all this stuff get here? I opt for less faith and immaterial existence that started matter, because I know scientifically matter can't start itself. So my starting point, my foundation is a little stronger than sand. Now we move from there and we look at the teleology of the universe. We look at the order in the universe. And as I said, there's about 120 constants. The rotation of the earth, the distance of the earth from the sun, that keep everything going. There seems to be order and design, not seems to be, there is order and design in the universe. That doesn't preclude disorder, but you account for disorder in a naturalistic framework. How do you account for order in a naturalistic framework? You can't. Give it enough time, enough monkeys can type the encyclopedia, atheists have told me. You get that? Give it enough time, a bunch of monkeys can type the Encyclopedia Britannica. Atheists must have faith in that theory. I find that laughable. I find that absurd. But that's one of the doctrines of naturalism in terms of the argument of teleology. That how do you have the design not just of the plant life, not just biology, but of the human body? I referenced the eye earlier. How does an eye evolve when you need two eyes to function properly? There's a million different questions, but in terms of the two systems, naturalism accounts for disorder, it doesn't account for order. Theism accounts for disorder and order, so it accomplishes the teleological issues more effectively. Moving from there, axiology, ethics, and this is my area of specialty, philosophically, logically. How do you know the good if it's contained inside the human experience? If the human experience determines the good, who are we, by the way? Who is the United States to tell any country they can't gas their children? Who are we to tell anybody that? Who are we to tell Africans they can't, in the middle of Africa, they can't sacrifice babies in a ritual that is so necessary to their tribal existence? Who are we to say they can't do that? What right do we have? Well, here's where the naturalist, finding ethics in a naturalistic world just through matter and thought processes, has to step out. Here's where naturalists cheat. The theistic view says there's something above mankind, and in this mankind are ethics, truth, justice, and the American way. So the naturalist has to argue naturalistically here, but reach over into theism, grab those things, and then construct an artificial template to validate some sort of non-religious ethic. It's absurd. It dies on its face when you simply say, those people don't believe you. What authority, Eddie Tabash, do you have to judge anybody about any ethical behavior if their brains are telling them that's right? I could judge them simply based upon the fact that something greater than us has given us the area of ethics and axiology. I would love to debate Mr. Tabash or anybody, an extended debate on how ethics prove philosophically and logically, not scientifically, God exists more so than God doesn't exist. But now we get into the purpose in life. And these are tough issues, I understand, and I hope that all of us leave from here and think these through. Especially my buddy Eddie here in terms of coming over to the agnostic side a bit. But these are tough issues, and philosophically and logically, and I understand the difficulty I have in having people who live in a postmodern society where relativistic thinking, whatever they want to do is okay, what's right for you is right for you, what's good for you is good. If he doesn't like that, this relativism that's come out of postmodern society, out of the 60s, I understand how hard it is to force rigorous logical thinking, but consider this, those of you who are atheists or naturalists, consider this. What sense does life make? Really? What sense does life make if it's temporal? What value does life have? If value is temporal, and if the human existence is temporal, then human value, premise, conclusion, is temporal. The value you place on your own life, the value you place on your work, the value you place on your family, the value you place in anything disappears in a flash. It doesn't matter. And it certainly doesn't matter to you. You can argue, well, I'll leave a history for others. I'll help people in my life. That's great. That's wonderful. What does it matter to you as a human being, as an individual? Because in the darkness of everyone's life, at those quiet, dark moments, and when I was in that fraternity house, driving my car, racing cars, Ferraris, Porsches, and having a blast, I used to sit down at night and go, is this it? Is this all there is? I mean, and as a young guy, I had an existential crisis. I didn't even know what it was. But I said, there's got to be more to life. There's got to be something. And for a naturalist and atheist like Eddie to simply say, nope, sorry, dead, worms, done, over, next. I don't know how a human being can truly believe that and live with contentment and peace in their lives. It's very, very difficult. You have to live a life that is not actual. You have to make believe you're happy. You have to make believe you know what's right. You have to make believe that you're not scared of eternity. And there are brave people that go to their deathbed saying, screw God, who cares? It happens. But does it have to happen? Does it have to happen to you? Because when all is said and done, you're all by yourself and everybody has to make a decision. And as we said earlier, only two options. And you're betting very heavily that Eddie's right, matter came from itself. You're betting very, very heavily that the design, the beautiful, intricate design in the world came from disorder. You're betting very heavily on that. The anthropic concept, that the world is fine-tuned in such a way that our human existence can be here. You're betting very heavily that disorder and natural causes resulted in that. The human experience, spontaneous biogenesis, where are the missing links? If we have a monkey and we have a human, paleontologists and anthropologists have said, many, there should be zillions of these missing link forms in the fossil record? None. But you're betting heavily that that's how that happened. When it comes to ethics, and you tell somebody, you lied to me, upon what basis can you tell anyone they did anything wrong? The common understanding of our society. Now, philosophically, that collapses on itself when a society says, we don't believe that. How do you stand above the behavior of human beings if there isn't something active above the behavior of human beings? When you look at the totality of these bits of evidence, bits of information, and you look at the hypothesis, God exists or he doesn't, and you look at the 50-50 wager, I made a decision many years ago, I'm going with God. And 40-something years later, best decision I ever made in my life.
Well, we've heard from Tom tonight that he is now a Christian agnostic, and he made that concession to try to tie me into agnosticism. The definition of an agnostic is somebody who today says that there isn't enough evidence for me to choose one way or another. The definition of an atheist is someone who says today there is enough, and I'm saying today there is enough evidence. The definition of a capitalist is someone who says today there's enough information for me to be a capitalist, and if I'm a socialist 5 years from now, that doesn't change where I am today. Now, he talked about design and teleology and fine-tuning. Well, first of all, if God is all-powerful, why does he have to fine-tune? And these constants that Tom talked about are not necessarily so tightly wound that the slightest alteration would cause a collapse. Professor Fred Adams, a cosmologist, University of Michigan, demonstrated that the most important quantities that determine stellar structure, the gravitational constant, fine structure constant, and a composite parameter C that determines nuclear reaction rates, can function at only 1/4 of their current parameter space and still permit stars to be operational by way of nuclear fusion. So it's not that tightly wound, and even if it is, that's very poor design. If you design something so precariously that if you alter one thing it collapses, that's not very good design. Now, Tom says he's a Christian agnostic. The God he believes in could even be evil, but then he says there are eternal ramifications. Well, if there are eternal ramifications for not following Pascal's wager, he's talking about a God who punishes you just for not believing in him, regardless of how good you are. Well, why does he add that in if he's just trying to defend a bare-bones God? Now, he completely dropped the argument about consciousness dependent on the physical brain, and he said it was silly because what is the value of life if death is the end? Well, he's engaging in wishful thinking. The point is not, is it a sad reality that we end with death? The question is, do we end with death? The question is not, would we like our consciousness to be immortal? The question is, do the facts show that it is immortal? And my argument of consciousness dependent upon the physical brain shows that we are not immortal. So it is a question of fact, not a question of willful thinking. And he tried to talk about the universe coming about. He says, well, something can't come from nothing, but something can come out of the nothingness if God does it. Well, he still hasn't shown how outside of space and time God can do anything. So what he's saying is we don't yet understand all the constituent elements of how the universe came about, so we're going to postulate a magical being. There's really no justification for that. He talked about order. Well, he doesn't realize the universe has been around 13.8 billion years, which is enough time for things to happen. He completely ignores evolution by natural selection and ignored the argument I made about the close association between our DNA structure and that of gorillas. He talked about the fossil record being sparse. There are numerous precursors to humans that you find in human evolution. And also, considering how difficult fossilization is, it's remarkable we have as many fossils as we do. He talked about the onset of life on this planet. Well, there are all sorts of naturalistic explanations. There are heat vents in the deep ocean. They're the amino acids which were created with lightning in the Miller-Urey experiment in 1953. He talked about how the eye couldn't be more primitive, but yet in previous and more primitive animals throughout evolutionary history, we saw that. We saw there were creatures with just a small little pinhole that could emit light. Well, that was the precursor of today's eye. He's not been able to demonstrate that organisms have an irreducible complexity that were not able to pre-exist in a prior, more primitive form. And he talked about morality. Well, here's the thing. He refused to defend the Bible. So if the morality that he speaks of is so clear that it only exists because God gave it to us, where did God root it? Did he root it in the Bible? If Tom refused to defend the Bible, where else did God root it? Did he root it in our hearts? Well, then we're able to disagree on so many things. Also, it's Tom who is unable to define what is moral and what is good and what is not, because he just said that when horrendous evils occur, it may be part of God's larger plan. So that means he can't look at anything that happens, regardless of how horrible it is, and say, this is bad, this is immoral, this shouldn't happen, because it could be part of God's larger plan. Also, we have a serious dilemma. Is something good just because God designates it as being good, which means that goodness is arbitrary with God? Or is something good and God just has the wisdom to recognize it and command it, which means there is a separate standard distinct and apart from God in defining the good? Now, he completely dropped the ball on responding to my argument from scale and the infinitesimal size of our world compared to the rest of the universe. He did not at all address my argument from religious confusion and divine hiddenness. He didn't at all address again my argument for consciousness being dependent on the brain. He did nothing to show that my arguments that the evidence cuts against miracles is defective. He was not able to demonstrate at all that miracles and the occurrence of them are more likely than the non-occurrence, which I was able to demonstrate. He also was not able to show why free will is such an important commodity that it should be given free rein irrespective of how horrible people treat each other and should never be thwarted. He never explained why the cosmic Father would let one child severely torture another just so free will could play out. And he never explained why God couldn't have, being all-powerful, why God couldn't have created us to exercise free will, but just have more of us good people than bad people. The good people on this earth don't have any less free will than the bad people. Why couldn't there be more of them? He also did not at all refute my argument about the material nature of the world and the fact that we see matter, but we don't see supernatural substance. In order to prevail in tonight's debate, Tom would have had to show that there is a greater likelihood of a ghost in the universe than not a ghost in the universe, and he failed to do that. Now, he ridiculed my reference to aliens in the attic, and he completely dropped the ball on understanding what that analogy was to. It was, if we hear a noise in the attic and we can't explain what it was, if it's a total mystery, that doesn't justify your telling me that it was an alien from outer space. That is an analogy to the fact that we may not have all the answers as to how everything is as it is in our world, doesn't justify postulating a supernatural paranormal being. It was by analogy that all paranormal claims, including those of God and or space aliens, are not justified as God of the Gaps arguments. He completely dropped the ball on explaining that. He also didn't respond to any argument that the parameters of the universe, these fine-tuning constants that he speaks about, could be varied and changed. There have been numerous studies where they have varied a number of the constants, and stars that last over 1 billion years are still able to form, such as Victor Stenger's computer monkey god. And then there were also demonstrations by Steve Weinberg, the Nobel laureate scientist, physicist, that you could alter that there is a range, a 25% range of variable, and you could still have carbon. He also didn't explain why an all-powerful God couldn't have formed a silicon-based life. So with all of these, he has not carried his burden of proof to demonstrate that the supernatural is more likely than the natural. And I was able to sustain that based upon our experience, scientific and empirical. And remember the argument that I gave, even though Tom ridiculed it. The argument about the space alien in the attic. The fact that we don't have all the explanations doesn't justify leaping to a supernatural explanation. And also, I defined the God that I was arguing against. I said the all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God of monotheism. Tom didn't even define the God he was trying to defend, and chameleon-like changed the definition of that God to suit the question of the moment. Well, maybe he said the God I'm defending is evil. And then he said, oh, but then the God that I'm defending will impose eternal consequences on you if you don't believe in him. So if it's 50-50, you better cut in favor of believing in him because you know what he's going to do to you. Well, what God is it? You see, I from the outset defined the God that I said did not exist with specificity, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing. That I said that is the God that did not exist. Tom did not define with specificity without jumping all over the map as to the God he says does exist. So my definition was more clear as to which God does not exist than his definition was as to which God does exist. So in terms of that specificity, he kept changing the position. And I'm glad he's now a Christian agnostic, and maybe as he sees more of the scientific evidence of the natural cause of the universe, that will deepen and we will welcome it into the fold of free thinkers. Also, with respect to the value, it's not a question of whether we have value without God, whether we have meaning without God. Tonight's debate is, does God exist? Whether we like it or not. Even if it's the most dreary alternative in the world that there is no God, and there's nothing but sadness and no hope and a sense of doom, that's irrelevant to the singular question tonight, which is not, are we happier with God, but does God exist? The overwhelming weight of our physical world, the overwhelming weight of the evidence, is that it's much more likely than not that the universe is natural, not supernatural, and God does not exist. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked to ask a question by one of the sponsors behind this debate. And my question is, would you please raise your hand, not based on what area you believe, but if what you have heard tonight is making you doubt or reconsider your beliefs, one way or another. Is anyone doubting or reconsidering their beliefs as of yet? Well, like good Thai cooking, this may need to simmer just a little bit. I would also ask you, would you please give me by a show of hands pushing together if you enjoyed hearing from our speakers tonight? Thank you. Excellent. Now, a few bits to go over before the end. First of all, this debate could not have been possible without the help of the college and the help of several organizations. This is a Center for Inquiry sponsored debate, and if you would like to support things like this, regardless of which side you are on the debate, or which side you end up thinking about later, we wanted to hold this debate as a Center of Inquiry. And we would love to accept any of your donations out there on the table later on. There are also, I believe, still free magazines, free bookmarks. If you are a student, the Secular Student Alliance was instrumental in getting a lot of this grunt work. They moved this table here for me to sit at, and I greatly appreciate that. And if they are anywhere within your field of interest, please feel free to sign up with the Secular Student Alliance. Also, I would also point out, I want to repeat, I was worried that I had said it wrong in the beginning. If you are interested in Mr. Trent's style, please look up Sharia, the Threat to America, of which he's the co-author of. And thank you very much for being a very respectful, very intelligent audience tonight. Thank you very much, and good night.